Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. Today we are joined by an important guest to discuss the United States foreign policy in Africa. Our guest today is Manoela Borges. Manoela is a career diplomat with nearly 2 decades experience working with the U.S. Department of State. She's currently the first secretary of the Africa Watch at the U.S. Embassy in London. Manoela has also served at other U.S. embassies across the world and U.S. stations across, including African countries such as Ghana, Nigeria, and Mali. Manoela, we're very excited to have you on the podcast today, and you've had a very impressive and long experience in this job, and we do really look forward to your insight into this job. You're welcome.
Thanks so much, Michael. It's really wonderful to be with you this morning.
Great, brilliant. So I'll just ask, over the last 20-something years since 9/11, we've seen U.S. embassy kind of like evolved over the years. So, but before we talk about this trajectory, I wanted to ask, what is the current U.S. policy in Africa in relation to development and security?
Thanks, Michael. I think broadly, there's a recognition that in order to sustain security in Africa, in African states, you need to have open and democratic and prosperous states. We've seen that there's a clear link between democracy and security. So strong democracies are more stable, they're less prone to conflict, and they're also more resilient to malign influence. We've seen as well that democracies are able to leverage international partnerships. They're better positioned to attract investment and to improve outcomes for their citizenry. So whether that's in education, in health, in providing economic opportunity, and in other areas where citizens expect their governments to deliver for them. So I think this is what Secretary Blinken described when he outlined our policy for sub-Saharan Africa last year in Pretoria. And this policy was the result of broad consultation over time with African leaders, and that includes civil society leaders, to help identify those areas, those priorities where we would partner to address the challenges together. So I'd love to just give a very brief overview of those 4 areas, because I think that really gets at the question that you asked this morning. So the first is working with African partners to foster openness. And that means working with individuals, with communities, and with states to define their own paths, both domestically and in the international stage, And that includes defending the rules of the international system. And in some cases also, of course, modifying the international system to work better for African nations. This includes, providing pathway for ideas, for investment, and also increasing connectivity between communities and between states, which is, so critical to the global economy today. The second area is a recognition that democracies need to deliver for their people. And so that's where the U.S. Is partnering with states to do better on this. And I think it's a recognition as well from the U.S. perspective that there is no perfect democracy. The U.S. has plenty of challenges, as we have seen in recent years and continue to see today. So I think it's kind of a humble partnership to see where we can learn from one another, but also to invest in the areas that we know matter. The third area of our policy towards sub-Saharan Africa is working with African states to recover from the COVID pandemic, which is behind us in some ways, but not in others, and to continue to build economic growth. And this is where we, I think, really pull in, a number of longstanding U.S. programs toward on the continent, as well as new ones. So things like Feed the Future program, which has invested $11 billion to help build the capacity for food production on the continent, to build up agribusiness. New programs like President Biden and the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. And this is aimed at mobilizing hundreds of billions of dollars for investment in infrastructure financing. Programs like the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, which has invested $100 billion since it was created to build health capacity in Africa, and a lot of that has been to partners in African states. This program has saved 25 million lives. It's one of the most, I think, effective programs the U.S. has ever implemented, as well as continuing to engage the Young African Leaders Network, which now has 700,000 members and fosters, creativity and ingenuity to tackling future problems. And then the fourth and final piece of our policy towards sub-Saharan Africa is to help the clean energy transition. And this is a recognition that Africa is the most vulnerable region in the world to the effects of climate change. And so we're investing $3 billion, much of which goes to sub-Saharan Africa to adapt and shape this transition. So I think, the thing that I'd like to point out is that this partnership is also a recognition that increasingly African states need to have a platform on the world stage in order to help shape the global architecture that we put in place after World War II. And so the U.S. has championed a permanent African seat at the UN Security Council. We've successfully lobbied for the African Union to be a permanent member of the G20 group of nations. And we've also advocated successfully for reform in the multilateral development banks and international finance institutions to unlock more funding for African states to deal with things like climate change. And this is really a recognition from African leaders that this is needed. We kind of brought all this together, I think, in the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit last December, hosted in the United States, where the United States announced $55 billion of investment across a number of sectors over a 3-year period to together tackle these challenges. So I think, in summary, what really characterizes our approach to security development and kind of the long-term sustained piece is this aspect of partnership, so that we we worked in tandem with African leaders to shape our shared future.
Oh, that's great. There's clearly a pragmatic shift in this U.S. policy of the past till now. I think at the center of this current policy is partnership. That's the key word. And it seems from what you've said, we can see that the U.S. is taking Africa to be maybe a credible partner, and then also putting Africa's interests at the center of things. And I think that's the shift from the policies of the past. What is it that has altered or that has influenced this change in terms of seeing Africa as a credible partner? From what you said, advocating for them to have a permanent seat in the UN Council, Security Council, and the G20 membership, and also just putting them at the center of things. What has influenced that change from previous policies?
Well, I think it's more kind of continuity than change. But I think one of the things that really is front and center of our policy is the recognition of the central role that Africa will play in our global future. There's been a lot of, I think, anytime you participate in a conference that talks about Africa's future, the sort of the importance of the population simply, of African states will be increasingly a larger share of our of our world. And so I think we can't ignore any longer the partnership, the importance that African states will have in our global architecture and in our shared shared fate.
Great. You said something very interesting, and I wanted to take you up on that. It's the global infrastructure financing aspect of it, where the United States is also like funding infrastructure financing. And in some people have, when I go to conferences and then they talk about when they compare the United States or generally the West approach, foreign aid approach in Africa and other places, compared to like China's approach, for instance. People always say in Africa, they draw a distinction between a visible Chinese presence in terms of like maybe investment in infrastructure, or maybe it's the railway, airports, and then they compare it to traditional Western aids, and where you can really see those. But me hearing this from you now, well, it's quite interesting to hear that. It's quite intriguing. What is in that calculation? Are we looking at, is that feedback from what people have been saying in relation to what China is doing? Is that like, does that fit into that geopolitical, competition and rivalry? Is that where this is coming from?
Well, I think where it's coming from is, I mentioned that our approach to our policy towards sub-Saharan Africa was a result of listening to African partners of what they need. And one of those areas is investment in infrastructure, that used to be something traditionally that, international partners invested in earlier decades. It has not been the case for some time, but it's still very much needed, particularly as you see kind of shifts in populations from being rural to urban centers to increasing populations. We need to invest in infrastructure. And so figuring out innovative ways to do this, Western governments oftentimes aren't well positioned to finance it entirely themselves. And so it's figuring out how can we work with the private sector on some creative approaches to attracting investment. And at the same time, and when we talk about infrastructure, it's not just laying railroads, or building roads, but it's also interconnectivity in terms of communication. How do we kind of increase that at the same time in order to really improve, build up markets for certain things and strengthen and build economies.
Yeah, brilliant, brilliant. And it's going to be, does that also tie into Africa's, because Africa is also looking, I know African Union have got this ambition, this 2063 ambition, where they want to be able to take charge of control of, some of their future in the continent. And one of the things is to build this continental trade, to trade among themselves. And infrastructure and financing has always been a constraint. So does this also, is there a logic? Does this play into that logic of financing? Is there specific financing that goes into helping them in terms of this intra, because most of the trade you see in Africa is always, the majority of the trade is external to Africa rather than within the continent itself. So this global infrastructural financing scheme, does it speak to that, to the needs of the African continental free trade?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, ideally we would get to a point where there is freer trade, removal of barriers between the states in Africa, for maximizing trade and the movement of goods and people. We very much support the African continental, free trade area, and our missions around the continent have long worked to partner with African countries to improve phytosanitary standards, to break down, barriers to trade. So I think we very much leverage that existing support and investment that we've done as we look at these new and innovative approaches as well to build out infrastructure going forward.
In your first response, you mentioned strong democracy and how that is relevant to the prospect of economic development, prosperity for the African continent. But when we look at competition from places like China, who are aggressively, expanding in Africa, or look at Russia, for instance, or look at also the mid powers that are coming into Africa that care less about, such democratic values or human rights values. How does the US balance these interests or these competitions from other powers that care less about those values? Does the US necessarily have to compromise in promoting those values, or how are they able to balance this dynamics?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Secretary Blinken has said a number of times, that it's every nation is free to choose with whom it partners. For the United States, it's not about competition with Russia and China, and it's not about asking our partners in Africa to choose between partnering with the United States or with Russia or China or any other country. Our view is that where relationships are beneficial, where they contribute to prosperity for the country, where they build democratic institutions, where you have the ability to develop ways to solve shared challenges, that's the ideal. We know that the best outcomes for people anywhere is when governments are receptive to their needs and responsive to their voices. You asked specifically about human rights, and I'd say that no one benefits when human rights, respect for human rights, is ignored. We just have to look at the Sahel and maybe Mali specifically, where Russian paramilitary groups have been active, including Wagner. The number of deaths has increased significantly, as have the number of internally displaced persons, of refugees. And ultimately, if we're talking about security, this is bad for security. Where one thing that we've seen is that where Wagner is active, as Secretary Blinken has said, whenever we've seen them deploy, countries find themselves weaker, poorer, more insecure, and less independent. And this is clear in Mali. So, I think what I'd say is that the values of democracy and human rights are shared by African states and African citizens. They're not Western values. They're universal values.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you 100%. I agree 100%. The democracy and human rights are kind of like universal. And I'm currently doing a project that's looking at the perception of democracy in Africa. And when you talk about Wagner Group, there is, there's documented evidence of, the carnage that they unleash in these countries, in Central African Republic, in Mali, like you mentioned, in other countries as well. But then again, do you not think, or do you think the West should maybe inadvertently or directly should take part of the blame? Because then you see, where traditionally the Western states, led by the US, whether in the Sahel, where you've got counterterrorism partnership with countries in the Sahel for 4 years. And then you've seen where people feel like over the years, they've been unable to defeat insurgency in this place. And that has created incentive for rogue states or states such as Russia and Wagner Group to come in and then capitalize on it and say, listen, these guys are not, they've not done this in 10 years. If anything, insecurity has increased. And then to use that kind of like narrative to, to create disinformation and then take over situations in those places. So how do you think, or what level of responsibility should the West and the US take in creating those kind of like situations where states such as Russia and rogue groups such as Wagner Group is taken advantage of?
Well, you mentioned kind of a approach to counterterrorism assistance, security assistance in the past. I think one of the things that we've done, as we've looked at the way that we have provided security assistance after, after 9/11, for example, is a recognition that the investments that we provide in security, they, whether those be training of security forces, exchanges, everything that we do to increase the capacity of security forces to address the threats of terrorism, those investments need to be matched by significant and meaningful investments in all of the institutions that underpin democracy and promote resilience. And so the broader lesson that we've drawn is that when we overinvest in security and don't pay enough attention to governance and economic development, we can't sustain even the security gains that we may have experienced in the short term. So we certainly see this in the Sahel. So one approach kind of that we've taken as we've looked back at the way we've done security assistance is to kind of think about how we can do prevention a little bit better, and how we can bring the sort of the comprehensive tools of the U.S. government to bear on the work that we do in partnership with African states. So we have, for example, adopted a new program called the Global Fragility Act, as well as a strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability. And those both have, as I was mentioning, they both change the way that we're looking at how we do security assistance. So it's a whole of government approach that's tied to peace building, that's tied to inclusive economic development, and to good governance. And so mobilizing in Africa specifically, we're mobilizing $85 million for the coastal countries in West Africa, for example, to align our approach, and other resources and programs toward this. The Department of Defense is also aligning its increased security assistance within this new framework And and I think part of what we're trying to build in as well is a learning component, so that sometimes our bureaucracy moves much more slowly than the situation on the ground. And so in recognition of that, it's kind of the ability to kind of to reflect, to monitor, evaluate, and adapt to changing circumstances. You mentioned as well the issue of misinformation on the ground, the role that Wagner plays. I think that one of the things that we've seen is that there is an instrumentalizing of some of these narratives, particularly the anti-Western narratives, by coup leaders and by Wagner and other forces, really to fuel their own ends, for their own purposes. And so that's something that we very much need to keep in mind as we assess what is happening, and what the citizens of these states are really calling for on the ground.
Yeah, I agree with you again, and I appreciate the fact that you mentioned the over investment in security and how that has inadvertently, created a situation where people can now exploit that for their own personal gain. I had another guest on the show that was looking more peace operations in Africa, peace stabilization and stuff, and he mentioned similar stuff where peace operations can, whereas it can disincentivize governments or people in elites in these African countries to address fundamental needs. So because when it's framed in that counterterrorism narrative, and then there's that over focus on security to the detriment of focusing on fundamental structural needs, that creates that loophole. So I'm glad to hear that there's a shift in approach towards creating a whole society approach. But I think that's again it's one that started from it was an Obama's policy, a whole society approach. I think that was when we saw the CVE program, and where we saw that approach. But there was a brief disruption to that approach when Trump came in. So between Obama's and Biden's administration, I think there was a shift again from that approach. But that President Trump had a different kind of approach to Africa. How far did that set this approach back? Did it have any setback or not?
Well, on Africa policy, I think one of the remarkable things in the United States is how much bipartisan support there has been for the programs that we've had in Africa across administrations. So, sometimes because of the way that funding cycles work, because of how long, we have certain programs are funded for 3 years at a time, for example, and so there's actually remarkable continuity with respect to our policies in Africa, which is why we can point to the program that I mentioned earlier, on PEPFAR, which focused on health and had that incredible investment and incredible remarkable achievements, in saving so many lives. So I think I'd say there's more continuity than there's change, but too, emphasize there's a willingness to go back and see what hasn't worked so well and how we can improve upon that. And I think that's what this administration has been incredibly committed to. And you hear that from Secretary Blinken, from Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Molly Fee, and from President Biden, of course, and other leaders, and our engagements with leaders in Africa, the visits to the continent. So I think this administration has really kind of elevated our partnership, much of which has been longstanding, but some of which is reflective of the current needs.
Yes, there's an improved relationship, especially in the language, in the kind of language used compared, to the past administration in terms of how Africa is being viewed. And one of the things we saw again, if I go from from the Obama administration down to Trump and down to this administration. So during the Obama administration, we saw where the Lihiveti, whatever was you say for Nigeria, for instance, where the Obama administration didn't sell some military equipment to the Nigerian government because of an accusation of human rights violation. But when President Trump came, they released some of those things. But then perhaps we've seen an increased militarization from the state. We've recently seen like a drone, like an accident, maybe a drone accident from the Nigerian military where, they've killed, civilians. And we look at this and we look at, again, in terms of human rights and the constraint that the United States has in terms of like using the human rights framework to determine whether they need to have such military assistance to these countries. How do they solve that conundrum between providing the security assistance to these countries that are, in my own notion, using the terrorism framework indiscriminately? Because there's been some groups that have been prescribed that even internationally and nationally, they've condemned such prescription. Like in Nigeria, look at the IMN, you look at the IPOP, for instance, that have been prescribed by a terrorist group, and that gives the government incentive to then clamp down on them heavily. But these groups do not necessarily, qualify to be terrorist group. So how does the United States balance that conundrum in terms of like providing security assistance to Nigeria, to its partners such as Nigeria, and then, protecting the human rights of individuals?
Well, you mentioned the word conundrum. I think what I would say is that human rights is integral to security, especially, when we've been talking about the kind of long-term, what does sustained security over the long term look like? Human rights has to be an integral part of that. Ultimately, you're talking about security for the people. And if they feel terrorized by, a terrorist group or terrorized by their military, neither of those situations results in a longstanding peace and security. So, we know also the lessons of 9/11. We've learned that abuses by security forces and human rights violations are one of the leading drivers of violent extremism. So this, violence begets more violence. So as the United States looks toward partners to provide security assistance, as we engage in working with security forces to secure their borders and to address the violent insurgencies they might be facing, at the center of that is really an emphasis on human rights, on professionalization of security forces, and also of civilian control of the military. So this is part and parcel of all of the training that we do to security forces on the ground. And that's where we can only do this if we have states that are committed toward democratic governance. So, in the places where we've seen military coups, in West Africa and the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, we have suspended, both as a matter of policy and as a matter of law, the security assistance that we provide to the government. We've also suspended other forms of assistance that benefit the government directly, because this is not in keeping with our values, and frankly, on a pragmatic level, it's not building the sustainable peace and security that we're talking about. So, for example, following the coup in Niger in July, we suspended about $140 million worth of security assistance. We also suspended more than $300 million in a Millennium Challenge Corporation compact with the country. If we turn to Burkina Faso, where there's huge security and human rights crisis, we are urging the Burkina Faso forces to adopt an approach security that centers civilian institutions, so the police, for example. You know, and the rationale here being that if we adopt a very militarized approach, as we see in Mali, it's bound to fail over the long term. So, you know, it all comes back to the sort of the comprehensive approach to security that we've been discussing today.
Okay, that's quite interesting. Before I come to the last question, even though we talk about you know, this comprehensive approach, we've seen in the last, maybe since ISIS has been defeated in the Middle East, we've seen like a transition in Africa. Africa seems to be that epicenter of you know, global terrorism, where you've seen several ISIS process in different regions or countries in Africa. How does the US deal with these threats in the current climate? And then again, I was going to link that up into the yeah. But first of all, yeah, go ahead, answer that. Yeah, how does the US deal with the threat?
Sure. You know, so I think you know, we've used the word comprehensive a lot, but that really is kind of sums up nicely the approach in the U.S. You know, we talk a lot sometimes about the 3 Ds, so development, diplomacy, and defense. And so that, you know, that's what we mean here when we say comprehensive. You know, and I touched briefly on some of how we've kind of modified or adapted our approach to preventing instability and conflict on the continent. The Global Fragility Act and the strategy to promote stability and prevent conflict. You know, what they do is to emphasize the economic and political drivers of instability. So looking at things like obstacles to women's participation in the economy and, you know, political representation of marginalized groups, for example. The idea of investing in these areas where we've done less work in the past is that if we do this investment upfront, it hopefully in the future, you know, will preclude the need for more costly military and humanitarian interventions over time. So some of the work we're doing within these frameworks is to help cultivate relationships and dialogue between community leaders, governments, and security forces to reduce tensions in different areas. We're also working with governments to you know, lessen the destabilizing impact of climate change. So we've seen in Africa that droughts have been longer and more severe and more frequent, and that, of course, increases the competition for scarce resources. And so this sustained diplomacy has a lot of diplomacy and other approach has a lot of support from Congress, where, you know, there's been a bipartisan agreement to invest $20 million a year over the next 10 years, specifically for this, you know, for the Global Fragility Act and the strategy to promote stability and prevent conflict. I also want to mention, you know, the incredibly important and central role that African organizations play increasingly on the continent in you know, political negotiation, in transitions back to democratic regime, in thinking about what a new architecture of you know, peacekeeping programs will look like. So, you know, we have worked very closely with the African Union. In West Africa, where we've talked about some today, you know, the Economic Community of West African States is really leading the charge in negotiating with the military regime in Niger about how to reach a concrete and a credible timeline to toward democracy. And part of that is leveraging the U.S. assistance that I mentioned. We suspended when there was a coup, is to say, to Niger that, if there are credible steps being taken toward democracy, we can re-engage again. And so very much working to continue to build economic growth and to continue to invest in some of these critical areas. So I think that's really kind of the broad approach. There are three things I think really summarize the U.S. U.S. partnership and approach and thinking on development and security in Africa. And the first is what we touched on in the beginning, which is the critical links between development, good governance, between resilient institutions, in reaching peace and security that lasts. The second is the leadership of African organizations in addressing these issues and laying the foundations for sustainable peace. And then the third and last is, that emphasis on partnership again, which is the U.S. partnership with African leaders and communities is a recognition of our shared priorities and ultimately of the shared global fate.
Obviously, that I can see an improvement in the past, because when we started talking about integration of development and diplomacy and defense, and then in the UK, for instance, in the UK we had similar stuff, and in Canada and similar stuff, and then we had that conflict and security stabilization fund in the UK as well. Initially when we were criticizing that, we're looking at in terms of the language, it was more like our security. We're doing this to prevent, we deal with the insecurity so that it doesn't come to us. But I can clearly see a shift where this is the needs or development of the African states have been integrated into the whole calculation. But then again, what I like that you mentioned is looking at all the aspects that were underinvested in, like diplomacy. And that again ties into our last guest. He talked about, when he was comparing diplomacy and peace operation, he said peace operation is just to create should be just one of the options. The diplomacy is actually the key thing to be able to negotiate, have negotiated settlements, have diplomats going in there to do the actual work. That peace operation sometimes is very necessary to create a short-term stability where you can then invest development and all those things. And me hearing you say this, it shows me that I think we're thinking in the right direction and going towards the right direction to how to solve these issues. But I will come to the last questions. I will not delay you further. When you started, you said something very important. You said there is no perfect democracy anywhere. And then you also said something like democracy and human rights are not the exclusive rights of any country. They're not particularly Western. So there's this project I'm working on, looking at the prospect of all the idea of an African democracy, African style democracy. Should we think about that? What would that look like? So you saying that, I was quite interested. I want to ask you, do you think liberal democracy, so if we look at how the United States promotes, maybe election, like for instance in Nigeria, I'm quite well, is molded on the American system. And you look at multi-party democracy, and then you look at these places, we have violence that are associated with elections, and you see elections that are not free and fair. And like you mentioned in the past, the United States as well has had its own. We saw during the last election, that brought in President Biden. But in Africa, it's quite prevalent where people are saying, "Is this really working? Is elections working for us? Or should we be looking at different approaches?" So should the United States be supporting Africa to develop a democratic system that is quite unique to them, and also that helps, or should they? Because I've got some perceptions, some survey, and people are saying, "Oh, this democracy is alien to us." we should go back to? Is there anything like that? What would that look like if if the USA was to support something like that?
Yeah, I think ultimately, what we mean by democracy is creating space for all of the groups in society and all individuals to be able to have a voice in shaping the government that then has an impact on their lives. And in different places, this is going to look different, but I think some of the commonalities are, and I think it's a very interesting project. The one that you described is to take a look at and see how can we do better in partnership at elevating some of these voices that have been marginalized in the past, whether that's specific communities or specific identities, and how do we create a space for that to have then a political debate and political conflict to be worked out in that civic space and not then erupt into violence. And I think as Secretary Blinken mentioned when he delivered our approach to sub-Saharan Africa in Pretoria last year, it is that there will be different models in different places that work, for those better than. There's no one size fits all model, essentially, of democracy. And so when we kind of look at only at elections as the marker of whether there is a democracy or not, I think that's we're learning those lessons. That's certainly not the only thing. We have to look at everything that underpins that then results in the ability of people to feel like their voices have been heard, and they have a real ability to hold their governments accountable. So I look forward to hearing the results of your work. Actually, I think this will feed very nicely into some of the thinking that we're doing in the United States, as well as we partner with African governments.
Yeah, thank you, Manoela, for this interesting conversation. I'm so grateful for your deep insights and for letting our listeners and our viewers know, understand the U.S. Foreign policy in Africa, and I've learned a lot myself. Seeing the shifts and the trajectory of and the lessons we've learned, and also the ability to accept that in the past we could have done it a lot better in this way, and then also then adapting the changes in moving forward. Really appreciate your time. I appreciate for this exciting conversation, and hopefully we'll bring you up here again.
Thank you so much, Michael.
I'm really grateful.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Right. Same here. Yeah, thank you once again for tuning in to today's episode with myself, your host, and Dr. Manoela Borges, who has provided us with a very deep insight into U.S. foreign policy in Africa. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay tuned for the next episode. Bye for now.